Montana Territory, 1882. The sun hung low, casting long gold lines across the dry ridges east of the Musselshell River when she collapsed in the dust, her bonnet slipping from her head and her knees giving out beneath her. Her dress, once pale blue, was streaked with trail dirt and sweat, and her lips were cracked from thirst. She did not cry out. She just folded at the waist like something finally broken. Dawson Keller spotted her from the saddle, a dark shape slumped between two scraggly sagebrush. He was riding back from dropping off cattle at a railhead 2 days south, and he would have missed her if not for the glint of metal a brooch pinned at her collar, catching the last of the daylight. He dismounted fast, boots kicking up dust. "Madam," he said as he knelt beside her. "Madam, can you hear me?" She did not respond. Her breathing was shallow, her wrist limp in his hand. Dawson looked toward the west. The sun would be gone in less than an hour, and there was no town, no homestead, no water for miles. He pulled his canteen from his saddlebag and wet a cloth, pressing it gently to her forehead. Then he lifted her, careful and slow, as if she might vanish if he moved too fast. She was light, too light. Her ribs pressed against the fabric of her dress. He mounted up and settled her in front of him, one arm around her waist to keep her from slipping. Her head rested against his chest, and he could feel the heat rolling off her like fever. "You hold on, all right," he said softly, nudging his horse into a steady lope. "You are not dying out here. Not today." He rode straight through dusk, eyes sharp for shelter. A half-collapsed line shack came into view just as the sky turned black. Nothing but 4 walls and a roof, but it would do for the night. He laid her down on his bedroll, lit a fire, and boiled water. When she stirred, it was close to midnight. Her eyes fluttered open, pale green and unfocused, and she tried to sit up. "Easy," Dawson said, crouching beside her. "You are safe now," she blinked. Where am I?" Line shack, about 20 miles west of the Musselshell. "You passed out on the trail. I found you." She stared at him, confusion flickering into fear. "My horse?" "Nowhere near. Looked like you had been walking a long while." She swallowed hard, and her fingers curled into the blanket he had wrapped around her. "My name's Verity Harlan," he nodded. "Dawson Keller, you are lucky I came along when I did." "No," she whispered. "I am not lucky, not today." She turned her face away, but not before he saw the tears start. He did not push her. Instead, he handed her the canteen and sat back, letting the fire crackle between them. "In the morning," she said little. Just sipped the broth he made and kept her eyes low. Dawson did not ask questions. He had worked with enough broken horses to know that gentleness got you further than force. They rode slow the next day, Verity seated behind him now, her arms loose around his waist, her cheek brushing his back when she dozed. He talked, mostly to fill the silence, about the cattle drive, about his ranch near Judith Gap, about nothing at all. On the third day, as they crested a ridge overlooking a green valley, she finally spoke more than 2 words. "I was trying to get to Lewistown," she said, voice hoarse. "My sister lives near there. I thought I could make it on foot after the horse spooked. But I got turned around and then I ran out of water." "You always ride alone," her face tightened. "I had no choice." He waited. "I left a man in Miles City," she said finally. "Left everything. I took the horse and what I could carry. He was not kind." Dawson's jaw tensed. He said nothing, just reached for her hand where it rested against his side. She let him hold it. That night they camped near a stream, and she washed her face in the cold water, her hands trembling. He watched her from the fire, the way she moved like someone still expecting to be struck. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly, eyes on the flames. "Because you needed help." "That's simple," he shrugged. "Seemed that way to me." She looked at him for a long time, then moved closer to the fire. "I do not think I have ever known someone like you," he smiled, small and quiet. "Guess there is a first time for everything." By the fifth day, they reached Dawson's ranch. The house stood simple but sturdy under the wide sky, with a barn and two lean toss out back. He had not brought a woman home since his mother died 6 years ago. He never saw the point. But when Verity stepped off his horse and looked around with wide eyes, he felt something settle inside him. "You can stay here as long as you need," he said. She looked up at him, hair loose around her shoulders, sun catching in the strands. "And if I do not want to leave, then I would be glad." She smiled, the first real one he had seen. "I think I might stay then." That night she sat close beside him on the porch, the stars thick overhead. He reached for her hand again, and this time she laced her fingers through his. "You saved me," she said softly. "No," he said, turning to look at her. "You saved yourself, I just helped you get the rest of the way." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Well, do not let go now. I was never planning to." The first frost came early that year. By late September, ice crusted the troughs before dawn, and the cottonwoods along the creek had turned to pale gold. Dawson was out early with the axe, splitting the last of the tamarack for firewood, when he heard the door open behind him. Verity stepped out wrapped in one of the wool blankets from the house, her hair braided down her back, her breath a thin cloud in the cold air. She didn't say anything at first, just stood watching him work, her eyes steady. "You sleep all right?" he asked, setting another log on the stump. She nodded. "Better than I did last week. I'll take that as progress." She stepped closer, her boots crunching over the hard ground. She had taken to wearing a pair of his mother's old shoes, too wide in the heel but better than the trail-worn ones she'd arrived with. "I was thinking," she said, voice low, "if you showed me how, I could help with the canning today. That way the apples don't go to waste." Dawson paused mid-swing. "You sure you're up to it? I don't like sitting still." He set the axe down and wiped his palms on his trousers. "All right then. We'll start with the jars. You'll need to boil them first." Inside, she moved with caution but not hesitation. She handled the glass like she'd done it before, and when she leaned over the pot to check the seal on the lids, he saw the faint burned scar along her forearm. He didn't ask. He just handed her another towel. By midday, the kitchen smelled of clove and vinegar. The stove was hot enough to make them sweat, but Verity didn't complain. She worked in quiet rhythm, slicing fruit with practiced hands, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. "You done this before?" Dawson asked, stacking the filled jars upside down to cool. "My mother taught me," she said, wiping her wrist with the corner of her apron. "She used to say, put food by and you'll never go cold." Smart woman she was, her voice caught. "She died last winter." He waited, but she didn't add more. Instead, she turned toward the window above the basin, where the hills showed patches of snow on the northern slope. "Do you ever feel like you're still figuring out how to be a person again?" she asked, not looking at him. He set the last jar down. "Every day." She turned then, slowly, her eyes finding his. "I keep expecting to wake up back there, in that house, hearing the latch turn. You ain't there anymore, I know." She pressed a hand to her chest. "But it's like my bones haven't caught up yet." He crossed the room and stood beside her, close but not touching. "You'll feel it when they do, and when they do, you won't mistake it." She nodded once. Then, quietly, "I like the way you talk. Like things aren't rushed." "I don't see the point in rushing." Later that evening, they sat on the back step with mugs of coffee gone cold between their hands. The orchard stretched behind them, apples still clinging to the upper branches. A jay called once from the fence post and then fell silent. "Your mother," Verity said, tracing the rim of her mug, "was she the one who built this house, with my father? Came up from Missouri before the war. Said the grass here was rich enough to keep cattle fat through winter." He smiled faintly. "She was the kind who didn't say much, but what she said stuck. I can see that." He watched her profile in the fading light, the way her mouth pulled slightly at the corners when she was thinking. "You ever want to write her name on the wall inside," he said. "Next to the others who mattered, you can." She blinked, surprised. "You'd let me do that? It's your house now, too." She stared at him, long and quiet. "You're not asking me to stay." "No. But you're not asking me to go either." He met her eyes. "I figure you're worth waiting on." She set her mug down beside hers and reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his. "I never expected to feel safe again." "You are." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that until the wind picked up and the stars came out, one by one. By mid-October, the creek beside the pasture ran slower, rimmed with thin plates of ice that cracked under boot heels. Verity stood at the edge of the barn, watching Dawson fit new shoes to the roan gelding's hind hooves. The rasp sang against the iron, steady as breath. "I've been thinking about putting in a row of cabbages next spring," she said, arms folded against the morning chill. "Up near the fence line. That patch gets good light." Dawson straightened, brushing grit from his hands. "So you're planning on seeing spring, then?" She smiled without looking at him. "I never said otherwise. You didn't have to." They both knew it was the first time she'd spoken of the future as if it might belong to her. That evening, she found the ledger book in the bottom drawer of the sideboard, worn thin at the corners. Dawson had kept the accounts in neat, slanted handwriting, each month marked with cattle counts and supply costs. She ran her finger over the column heads, then carried it to the table without a word. When he returned from checking the north fence, he saw her bent over the page, brows drawn. "You do math in your head or with figures?" she asked, not glancing up. "Mostly head." "Why?" "You've been underestimating feed prices by close to $1 a barrel. That's why the margins look wider than they are." He moved to stand behind her, reading the line she pointed to. "I didn't notice." "I did." He didn't speak for a moment. "Then you want to keep the books, if you don't mind." "I'd be grateful." She closed the ledger and set it aside. "Did you always notice numbers like that?" he asked. "My father ran a smithy." She rested her hands on the table. "He said if a man couldn't count his own bolts, someone else would cheat him out of half." Sounds like he had sense. He did. Until he took sick and left me and my sister trying to pay off the debt. She turned to face him fully then, something steadier in her posture than he'd seen before. "I want to belong to the work here," she said. "Not just the quiet." "You already do." "No, Dawson, I mean it." He met her gaze. "Then let's not waste time pretending otherwise." They spent the next week side by side. She mended the porch rail while he repaired the chicken coop. She learned the rhythm of the ranch, the slow thaw of sun on frozen ground, the way the wind leaned different against the west-facing gate. He showed her how to edge the field rows with ash to keep pests off come spring, and in return, she taught him how to steep willow bark to ease the ache in his shoulder from an old break. One afternoon, after hauling sacks of grain from the wagon, she paused beside the woodpile, breath catching. "I used to be afraid of quiet," she said. "Every time it went still, I thought something bad was about to happen. What changed?" I started listening to what it was saying. She leaned against the railing. "Out here, quiet doesn't mean danger. It means nothing's wrong." He unlatched the barn door, pausing. "You ever think you'd find a place where nothing's wrong?" "No, but I think I'm learning what it feels like." That night, she stayed in the doorway of his room longer than usual, her shawl drawn tight across her shoulders. "I don't want to sleep alone tonight," she said, voice even. He stepped aside, letting her pass. No words were needed beyond that. They lay side by side, not touching at first. The room was dim, lit only by the hearth glow. She turned toward him, eyes open in the dark. "I want to build something with you," she said. "Not just stay safe." He reached for her hand, fingers warm against hers. "Then we'll build it, together." And when she tucked herself beneath his arm, breathing deep and steady at last, he knew there'd be no more waiting. She'd come back to herself, and she'd come back to him. The wind shifted as November came on, dry and sharp off the high ridges. Dawson strung wire across the southern pasture while Verity patched the lining of his winter coat by lantern light. They had settled into something quiet but certain, each hour shaped by the work, each evening marked by simple closeness. No promises spoken, none needed. One morning, Verity stood beside the barn with a folded scrap of paper in her hand, her jaw set. Dawson noticed her thumb tracing the creases. "You expecting something?" he asked, setting down the milk pail. She looked up slowly. The mercantile wagon stopped at the neighboring ranch. The driver passed this along. He wiped his hands on his trousers before taking the note. The handwriting was unfamiliar, careful but tight. She didn't explain, so he waited. "My sister," she said at last. "She's married now. Her husband's got a claim near Lewistown. She says they've room for me." Dawson didn't move. "Did she know you'd found a place here?" I hadn't written. Her voice was even. I didn't want to bring anything old into something just beginning. He turned the paper over once, then handed it back. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know," she said after a long pause. "She's blood, but I'm not the same woman who left Miles City." "Then it's not just about where she is. It's about who you are now." She nodded slowly. "I owe her a letter at least. You can ride into town tomorrow. I'll hitch the team." "No," she said. "I'd rather walk it to the mail station myself. I need the space." He studied her face. "All right." The next morning she left before sunrise with a satchel and her shawl. She walked the 6 miles west without stopping, past frozen creeks and cottonwoods stripped bare. When she reached the post station, she stood for a while before entering, then handed the envelope to the clerk without a word. Dawson was in the north pasture when she returned near dusk. She didn't speak until he'd finished checking the gate. "I told her I'd found something good," she said, brushing frost from her sleeve. "That I was safe, that I'd stay where I was wanted." He didn't answer, just stepped close enough for her to feel the warmth off his coat. "I didn't think I'd ever tell someone I was staying," she added. "It always felt like a risk." "Still might be," he said, "but I'll be standing in it with you." Later, they shared supper without much talk. She handed him a bowl of beans and cornbread, and he passed her a tin of molasses without needing to ask. Afterward, she lit the lamp in her room and sat at the small table, mending a tear in the hem of her winter dress. "Dawson," she said, not looking up, "I want to marry you." He didn't speak right away, just crossed the worn rug and leaned against the doorframe. "You sure?" "I'm not afraid of wanting it anymore." He stepped inside the room, his boots soft on the floorboards. "There's no preacher close. We'd have to ride into Judith Gap. I don't need a preacher to know what's true." He reached down and took her hand, fingers calloused and certain. Then it settled. She stood, slow and sure, and looked up at him. "I want a quiet life, a garden. A cow maybe, if we can afford one come spring. We'll manage it. I want to wake up knowing I'm not alone anymore. You won't be." They stood in the lamplight, the silence between them full of understanding. No grand declarations, no vows spoken loud. Just two people choosing one another with open eyes. Outside, snow began to fall fine and slow, dusting the yard in silence. Inside, they stood close, their foreheads touching, the warmth between them stronger than the cold pressing at the windows. The snow deepened in the coming days, blanketing the pasture in a hushed stillness that settled into the bones of the land. By mid-December, the ranch had taken on a kind of rhythm that belonged to the cold split wood stacked high against the house wall, lanterns trimmed low to stretch the oil, and the steady hush of breath visible in the morning kitchen. Verity stood at the table by the window, drying her hands on a faded linen cloth, watching the way the wind traced across the yard and lifted loose flakes from the eaves. Dawson came in from the barn, stomping snow from his boots and pulling off his gloves. "She calved early," he said, hanging his coat by the stove. "Spotted her just before the frost set in too hard. Brown heifer, strong legs." Verity turned from the window, smile faint but warm. "That's good luck." "Could be," he said, tilting his head toward the kettle. "You want tea?" "I'd rather coffee." He reached for the tin on the shelf and paused, glancing at her. "You ever think about raising something more than chickens and vegetables?" Her brow lifted slightly. "Such as?" "Maybe children," he said, voice quiet but steady. "If you wanted to." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the stove, picked up the kettle, and poured the boiling water over grounds. The scent rose up between them. "I used to think I'd never be any kind of mother," she said, stirring. "Not after what I came from, but now. I could see it, with you." He stepped closer, not touching her, just standing near. "I'd raise them with you, Verity. Not over you, not behind you." She set the spoon down and turned to him. "I'd want to teach them to plant things with their own hands, and to raid. To see what's possible," he nodded. "And I'd teach them how to mend a fence and keep their word." She touched his chest, just lightly, her fingers resting over his shirt. "Then I'd say we've got enough to start with." They married in late January, when the snow lay thick enough to silence the trail and the creek ran dark beneath its frozen skin. The preacher from Judith Gap came by sleigh, his wife beside him with a wool-wrapped Bible and a basket of winter pears. Verity wore a dark green dress Dawson had ordered from a catalog months before, one she hadn't known he'd kept hidden in the chest at the foot of their bed. Her hair was braided in a crown, and she had fastened a pin at her throat, her mother's brooch, the same one Dawson had seen glinting in the sagebrush that first day. They stood before the hearth, the fire casting long shadows across the floorboards. His hand was steady in hers, his thumb brushing her knuckles as the words were spoken. When it was done, and the preacher had said his blessings, they stood for a long while as the others stepped back, the room quiet except for the crackling of the logs. "I never thought I'd have this," she whispered. "Not like this." He leaned in, forehead resting against hers. "You didn't find it, Verity. You made it." They ate supper with the preacher and his wife, then saw them off before the sun dropped too low. That night, Dawson and Verity lay together in the warmth of their home, the snow whispering against the windows, the silence full of belonging. Spring arrived slow and wet, turning the pasture to thick mud and coaxing pale shoots from the garden beds. Verity knelt in the dirt one morning, her hands covered in loam, her belly just beginning to swell beneath her dress. Dawson came up from the creek with a pail of water, setting it beside her. "I thought you might need this." She sat back on her heels, smiling up at him. "I do." They built a cradle that summer, Dawson shaping the slats by hand while Verity stitched the quilt that would line it. She embroidered tiny stars in one corner, her needle slow and precise. One afternoon, as they walked the edge of the orchard, Dawson paused and looked out over the valley. "You ever miss what was?" She shook her head. "I carry it, but I don't miss it, and I don't fear it anymore." He reached for her hand. "Then we've done something right." When their daughter was born in the autumn, the leaves had just begun to turn. Verity held her close in the early light of morning, her hair damp against her brow, and Dawson sat beside her, both arms around them. "She's got your steadiness," Verity murmured. "I can feel it already." "And your will," he said. "That's what will carry her." They named her Clara, after Verity's mother. She grew strong and curious, toddling after chickens with a determined scowl and curling up in the crook of Dawson's arm each night as they watched the fire burn low. Years passed, gentle and full. They added to the house when Clara grew tall and planted lilacs by the porch. Verity taught reading at the church schoolhouse once a week, and Dawson took on a younger hand to help with the cattle. The land changed with them, weathered, softened, made good by care. And through it all, they remained what they had chosen to be. Two people who had found one another in the wide silence of the world and built something lasting from the quiet. They never spoke much of the years before, not because they forgot them, but because they had been folded into the lives they made. Not erased, only outgrown. In the end, it was never about rescue or salvation. It was about the hard work of staying to the land, to the promise, and to each other. And they did, always.